I will be talking about reimagining literacy lives, how to redefine literacies in a digital age. I'm going to start with a couple of quotations that I think encapsulate what I'm going to say. And the first one has to do with literacy in the everyday. So literacy happens in school, as we all know, as you all know, you live it on a daily basis. But it's also part of the fabric of being human. And Elliot Eisner said, the educator's job is not to do well in school, but to do well in life. And that's a bit of a loaded statement, but I feel that captures the theme of this talk. About living literacies in the everyday. And then the second quote is, when I met with Bjorn and Ina about a year ago, I said, listen, I want to speak to the needs of teachers. And they said, well, you could talk about the notion of the old wine in new bottles. And this was a concept that Lancashire and Noble came up with, amongst others, some time ago, 2003. And they said many researchers have identified the old wine in new bottles syndrome, whereby long-standing school literacy routines have a new technology tacked on here or there without in any way changing the substance of the practice. The last bit of that quote is very important to what I'm going to say, because I'm going to offer some newer models, newer ways of thinking about the strands of literacy that you deal with on a daily basis. So, old wine in new bottles. Can you take what we know in the 20th century about reading and writing, picture yourself in a chair reading a book, and can you put that on a screen and say it's the same? Does it have the same properties? Does it have the same form and function? And in this talk, I argue, well, no. There are some of the same aspects, but certainly you can't make that transfer. And epistemologically, the way in which we think is a different way. Our brains are hardwired, are becoming hardwired in a different way. And I've certainly seen that with my own daughter and with children and with all the participants over the years I've seen. So do we read, write, and think differently with touch technologies? Think about that. So the structure of the talk is I want to think a little bit about the Swedish context. So I did some reading before I came, and then I sat with Peter, and he said, okay, so here are the goods. Here's some of the things you need to know, and that was very helpful. So, but part of it is, I think this will be relevant for you. It's an exciting time to be a teacher, but it's also a really daunting time, because policy hasn't met where our students are, really, and I think that came up with the first keynote, and it's certainly, again and again, you're seeing that in literature. And I want to contrast for a little bit. I don't like to create binaries, but I want to look at the contrast in what we've seen happen over the last century and what the key differences are. And then I'm going to look at some of the research I've done. And it's not to navel gaze and to talk about what I've done. It's more to illustrate how I try to touch on these different ways in which we're making meaning in different ways. And then step back for all of you as teachers and start to think, how does this actually shift practice? Swedish context. So one of the things I keep hearing is that you've had a large influx of different cultures have entered classrooms. So you have 200 minority language spoken. The highest numbers are Arabic, Farsi, Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Turkish. Is that fair to say? Yeah. And Sweden has become an increasingly multilingual country primarily because of this immigration and as a result of the elevation of 5 languages to the status of minority language. It's a real challenge. I know in Canada, we have that as well. So Toronto, you'll go into a classroom, you'll have 40 different languages happening. And in Ontario, like Sweden, we're using the 4 resources model. So questions to think about as I talk, and you can take a picture and you can write them down, or you could say, Jennifer, I'm not going to bother with them, but just think about them because I'd like to either talk to you after about them. In what ways does digital thinking impact you in terms of Swedish as a second language, teaching and learning? Can digital approaches to language literacy and language development help with other languages, other foreign languages in your classroom? How can policy speak to the realities of Swedish as a second language? And do technology, media, and digital literacy play a role in your planning and teaching? Okay, so just think about those. But before we do any of that, I want to give a little retrospective on where we've been in terms of technology. So I start with the book, but actually before the book, what did we have? We had oral cultures, okay? And oral cultures gradually became books. Books tended to be tied up with social class and with educated people who had the elite enough money to learn how to read and use books and so on and so forth, till we had mass education in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the 20th century rather. And then we started having, and then the television came into homes. And with the television coming into homes, we had a much more of a different form of communication, right? That's when we started thinking about screens. And then from that, we had the onslaught of lots of screens and laptops and Steve Jobs and Apple and then tablets. And now we wear our devices, right? How many people are wearing their device, wearing their form of communication? Yeah, so if you have Fitbits on or if you have an Apple Watch. And so that's our reality. Okay. Now, that's not for everybody. Not everybody can afford to have all the trappings of technology, but the point is that communication thinks in terms of that. But yet, we still exist very much in a book learning model internationally. So we talk about reading and decoding and fluency and comprehension in text genres. In writing, we talk about process writing and multi-genre writing, speaking and listening, oral language, storytelling, reader response. And then we start to get into visualizing and we think, okay, well, that's multimodal. And I know doing teacher ed work, I just taught a reading class last week, we still deal with that and we should, right? This is still our reality-ish, right? Because it's changed a lot. So I'm put a question mark beside then, because I think it is a bit of a then. The linear approach to literacy learning is something that we need to sort of shift out of as much as we can. Again, reading, decoding, fluency, comprehension, we've got writing, we've got speaking and listening, but it does feel a little bit like, although it's now, it needs to start become a then a little bit. In ways beyond as helpful as the New London group has been, it's still abstract. It's still not concretized into practice so that you know, how do I actually implement that? And that might be a bit of a controversial statement, but I think it's true. To me, these are the factors that are in play right now. So it's much more of a, to give a landscape model, it's a much more hybrid form of literacy we have. So the very far one with a little paintbrush is design. So we think in terms of design, right? That's one of the main tenets of the multiliteracies group. But how do we actually teach that? So design is about the visuals and the images, and the first speaker talked about that. But we also think in terms of social participation, right? So we think about creating something and then piping it out either locally or globally to people through Facebook and through Instagram and through Twitter. And most things are converged, right? So Henry Jenkins came up with that idea, but a phone isn't just a phone. You don't pick up a phone just to call a friend. A phone is your calendar. You can book your parking. You can get on a bus. You can look up something very quickly. We rely heavily on it. It's all converged into one thing. That's the best way for me to think about it. But even a lot of the educational texts that you use, e-textbooks, are converged designs, right? They've got written words, and then they've got little movies, and they might have a podcast, and they might have interactive clickable items. If you want to look at parts of an insect, that's what I just looked at last week. So we think in a converged kind of a logic now. And it's a tacit thing. It's not a thing that we necessarily ever teach, but that is part and parcel of understanding what texts do and how you think through them. We also have a lot of public-private going on. I mean, you might be sitting here thinking, oh, she's getting a bit dull. I'm going to text my friend and find out what they're doing later. So we move from these different spaces simultaneously, right? We might be in one spot, but be in a public venue. And it's fluid, and it flows. And we think in terms of hybridity. So some of you might have laptops or screens open, and you'll have multiple screens open right now. So you might have the conference website, you might have I don't know, an email to someone, you might be looking at a news feed, okay? And we think in terms of those hybrid kind of reading practices, but they're naturalized, they're lived. Remix, maybe you'll take a picture. And I think I said you're welcome to take pictures. I was supposed to say that, Bjorn said. And the slides will be available later. I'm supposed to say that too. And you can take a photo and remix it and make it into something else right now, okay? And then you also have the issue of co-curation. So one of the things that I have found, and I have worked with so many different learners. I mean, I've worked with over 100 different readers and writers and literate adolescents and children and teenagers, and a lot of them curate. A lot of them go and collect information. They're voracious for information. Now, that's not saying they do that kind of deep reading, but they collect a lot of information that they use very quickly, and I'll illustrate that. So curation, to me, is a very key skill that's developed and honed. I'm not saying they do it well necessarily, but they do a lot of it. So 2 key points, and this isn't my take. This is sort of sitting on the shoulders of other people like Peter Freebody and Gunter Kress, and that's that communication almost always involves 2 or more modes of representation or expression. There's nothing profound about that, but that is a fact, okay? It's often visual in words. It could be moving images of words. It could be hypertext. But there's usually 2 or more in play. And what mode is best in a particular moment is quite important. And that's, again, something that students aren't necessarily good at. In one moment, a word, a sentence might work, a paragraph might work, a 5-paragraph essay might work. In another instance, it might be a photograph. And again, we saw that in the first keynote, that there are moments when photos are incredibly powerful, right? We are a world right now that's shown and not told, as Gunter Kress says. And so at certain moments, a word might afford greater meaning. At other moments, there might be a powerful photograph. And my experience with contemporary students is they're actually very good with those visual things and being able to do that. They may not be able to do it on an explicit level and say why and have the criticality to be able to describe it, but you can be sure that they're very good at identifying them, often. So my point, obviously, is that screen learning is a different thing. And you probably say, well, so what, Jennifer? What does that mean? We all say that, but we don't seem to be implementing it necessarily. So, for example, I do a lot of work interviewing people outside of school, like architects and graphic designers and video game developers and documentary filmmakers, about multimodality, because I feel we don't know enough about it. And one of the first things that anybody who's involved with graphic design says, well, the most obvious thing about screen reading is that you start in the top left corner and you move your way down, and the least important information is always in the right bottom corner. You don't go there. It's a dead land down there, right? Now, we don't teach reading that way. We don't teach that kind of orientation. That's one thing. We also don't teach reading and writing based necessarily on design epistemologies. So we don't talk about what good remix or bad remix is, or what blending or use of color and all of that, because we're not trained to do that. And that's the tricky thing as teachers. And that's why I say it's very daunting to be a teacher now. We also have very unpredictable reading paths. We can often start on something and end up in a very different place, and it's a rabbit's hole, right? We can while away hours sitting in front of a screen looking up endless things, and we don't know where we're going to go necessarily. So reading path is also a very different thing. And then there's this sticky point that Nicholas Carr, who writes for the New York Times, talks about, is, are we becoming quite a shallow generation when it comes to reading? That sustained reading that we don't necessarily do, or at least our students don't do, what's going to be the result of that? And he calls it the shallows. So are we reading deeply? That I can't answer. I don't know. I know that reading on screen is different. So it's a different kind of a process than print-based texts, okay? We've sort of established that over 10 years. We've established also equally that there are different reading paths. So we know that we follow hypertext, and we know that it's different, and we know that navigation plays a role. I don't think we quite know about touch. Carrie Jewett has been looking at that. Ann Mangan in Norway has been looking at that. But the role of the haptic is going to be increasingly important, because I don't think we fully grasp it right now. So Carr claims that we're being hardwired in the architecture of our brains changing. So, and then you get 2 sides of the debate. You get the debate which is we need to go back to basics. We need to focus on the more traditional because we're losing that, a bit like losing languages. And then you get the other side, which is saying, you know, we can't fight it, let's work with it. I'm not sure it's that black and white, really. I think that there is a blending that can happen in a meaningful way. And I quite like Marianne Wolf's work when she says we must teach our children to be bitextual or multitextual, able to read and analyze text flexibly in a different way with more deliberate instruction at every stage of development on the inferential, demanding aspects of any text. So that's been around for a while, multiple genres, being critical about what they do. That's very much the four resources model. Who's the author? What are they saying? What is the format? How can I recreate it? I suppose what I don't see enough of is how can I make that into a short film that moves into a podcast that moves back into narrative text. And those sort of text movements are really the teaching that I've seen that can be quite powerful. Key features of modern reading, as I said, hybrid reading. Now this is based on doing quite a bit of iPad research with students documenting what they do online. They do follow the F pattern. A lot of them are autodidacts. I'll talk about that a bit later. A big finding that I found is that students tend to be, and I found this ironically, particularly with struggling readers, outside of school, they're quite voracious collectors of knowledge, autodidact, collecting, self-collecting knowledge, doing it on my own, learning myself, watching YouTube videos about making slime. I can't get over how many kids watch YouTube videos about making slime. And those sorts of texts, those I consider an autodidact practice, right? Watching a video about the periodic table or about some sort of chemical reaction. These are all forms of collecting information. It might not be decoding print, but nonetheless, it's still autodidact. And then there's the shift to ludic narratives. So with ludic narratives, it's a game-based notion. And it's the 20th century, we would read an author, and we still do very much now, and the author would let the story unfold, and we'd sit in a storied world. A ludic narrative, there's more a role of the reader, so it's playful, and you're given a bit more of an open terrain where the narrative isn't written and you write as you go. So when you play a game, you might play a Harry Potter game and be able to shift the characters in the game. Or you may be able to do that even when you produce a film. So ludic narratives would be a way of thinking, how can I shift, have a central story like an Odyssey story where there's a journey, but how can I shift that story as I go along, maybe shaped around my own reality? So writing. Writing I have more trouble with, funnily enough. Reading I can sort of get my mind around. I've done enough work sitting, documenting in a kind of careful ethnographic way about what happens on tablet-based reading. Writing is a tricky one because we have impoverished methods and we have impoverished ways of understanding multimodality. So as teachers of language and literacy, how do we reframe our understandings of writing, particularly when you're dealing with students who are new arrivals and who have, don't have the host language? How do you teach them some basics and make them excited about it? Modern day writing is about frequent writing. So anybody who looks at the research knows that there's a lot of writing that happens, but the writing tends to be short. There's more writing that happens, in point of fact. But it's shorter and it's not, the attention to detail isn't necessarily there. So there's an increased demand to design and produce multimodal texts such as PowerPoints and photograph essays, short films, so on and so forth. But how do we assess them? We don't have assessment frameworks for them. And that's also very difficult. And the closer relationship between reading and writing, we're constantly reading something and writing very quickly, little short texts. And it's a naturalized, lived literacy. Kate Paul and I are writing a book called Living Literacies. And in that, we talk about this notion. I want to do a little carousel of some international perspectives. And the only reason I want to do that is I want to get a sense globally about how disparate this digital literacy issue is. Now, this is slightly dated. I worked on this a few years ago with Kathy Burnett, Guy Merchant, and Julia Davis when we did a book on international perspectives. And Peter did the foreword, as I recall. So the United Kingdom with digital literacy is still quite into ICT. And my husband said, you better make sure you know what that acronym means. And I thought, I actually don't think I know what that acronym means. But anyway, something to do with technology and knowing technologies. They're interested in game-based approaches to an extent. I'd have to say it's a little bit of an old wine in new bottles. It's a little bit like, here are the technologies, and make them work, although they do have good multimodal work there. I think when you look at the policies, they're quite a bit more traditional. Unlike the Nordic countries, and I've told everybody here, we hold you up on a pedestal. We come here to see what you're doing. So Nordic countries are really held up high. You get high PISA scores, you have progressive models, you have shorter school days, no standardized tests, long summer breaks, and you still get these incredible grades. I don't know how you do it. And then you all look wonderful too. It's just sort of cruel. Anyway, you talk the talk. You're also arts and arts education. You have maker approaches, maker spaces, and problem solving. And so you really have cornered the market on exemplary literacy teaching and learning. And I'm not just saying that because I'm here. It's true. Singapore. Now, Peter will be able to speak to this, but my sense with Singapore is it's about civic literacy and global awareness and cross-cultural skills. It's about creating a citizenry committed to being digital. So they use the language of curation. They do emphasize social cultural sensitivity, and China does as well. And it encourages connections through critical thinking. China. In 2012, shifted models and had the Yun curriculum, which stresses individuality and individual expression, as well as emphasizing more traditional skills. So they were trying to navigate both. An awareness of information technology and acquiring basic technology skills. So that one's a little bit more of a complicated one. I use the phrase mutton dressed as lamb a bit, I think, because I think that there is a fair bit of old wine in new bottles embedded within that, maybe. But I don't know, so that's probably not fair to say entirely. Australia is part of, and some of the other countries I mentioned are part of a 21st century initiative. Finland, the United States, and Singapore. There was a real push to get a lot of tablets in students' hands. It carries similar principles. There is an inquiry focus. There is a problem-solving focus. I think there's probably more that, again, Peter Freebody can talk about. And then Canada. Canada's patchy. We're provincial, we have provincial curricula. So out west, Western Canada, it's more media-driven and multimodal. And as you move along the prairies, there's a wonderful pedagogy that's based on First Nations and Indigenous cultures. To me, it's one of the best examples, actually, of literacy because it's culturally infused, it's naturally multimodal, and it doesn't have a huge digital overlay, but it doesn't have to have one because multimodality is there, if you know what I mean. Multimodality, digital doesn't equal multimodality to me. Well, digital does, but they're not equated. Multimodality has been around for a long time. And then you move into Ontario, which, again, is an old wine in new bottles in my view. It's let's take these traditional skills and put them on iPads. And in Eastern Canada, it's quite multimodal. So it moves all over the place. And Quebec is alongside Eastern Canada in terms of that approach. So it's regional. Now I want to shift a little bit to say, so that's a sense of where we are, and I've said a lot of different things, okay? So think about that visual with a landscape of design and curation. And so what I wanted to do in my decade at Brock, in the Canada Research Chair, my entire job is about research, is do a series of different studies, and that's what I've done. I've done 10 different studies over 10 years, and I've looked at all the way from iPads all the way to movement work. And what I wanted to do is really start to isolate what's starting to happen with literacy from very different angles. So I've looked at cosmopolitanism and transculturalism in social media with a colleague, Rahat Naqvi, who looks at translanguaging and how adolescents use social media in order to mediate culture. I've done a lot of work on iPad thinking and pedagogy with two Australians, Maureen Walsh and Alison Simpson, and with Diane Lapp and Doug Fisher in the US, arts, aesthetics, and co-production with Kate Paul, and then my own work bringing professionals into classrooms, so bringing in documentary filmmakers and video game designers and professional coders to work with teachers and plan a curriculum and teach the curriculum. And then finally, more recently, I'm looking at affect and emotion. It's frankly jumping on the latest literacy studies bandwagon, but I find it very exciting to think about what emotions do in terms of writing, and that's with Christian Ehret. So, just to illustrate, is this new wine in new bottles? I don't want to say necessarily it is. It's trying to get at that. It's trying to get at some of these new ways of thinking. So I'll talk about reading by design, which is was an exploratory study that happened in 3 contexts: in Hamilton in Canada, in Sydney in Australia, and in San Diego in a high school. And all 3 sites, 40 students each, we looked at students documented what they did on iPads as they read. Crayons and iPads was an early years study where in the Niagara area we worked in 5 different early years contexts. And we looked at a month without an iPad and then 6 months with iPads in that early years context. Minecraft with Rob Simon at U of T. We sat with students as they played Minecraft with a smaller group, 20 adolescents, and they played the game and we did stimulated recall and we had them talk through what they were doing. And then thinking haptically, part of my research center has a community tutoring in it. And so over 2 years, I would do writing and reading and speaking and listening activities on the iPad. So reading by design. Large corpus of data, 3 different contexts. We did interviews, we observed, and we took a lot of video data. So there's a lot to analyze for this study. And we would do things like sit beside students and actually create these schematics, right? Which is sort of hard to understand. But these are all the movements when they're doing partner reading literacy activities. So you can see how much they're moving. And it's very hard to interpret this, but it's trying to capture the degree of relationality happening, but also the number of texts that they're covering over the span of 10 minutes. Moving back and forth from reading to producing a text. So it was a way of starting to create detailed inventory and audit of things that happen when you're on a tablet. The thinking haptically study to me was the most revealing because it happened after school and we could work with, so what we had were students who were in the concurrent education program at Brock University would tutor children in the community for 1 hour and teach them on iPads. And it was shaped around what they were interested in, what they needed to focus on. So working with Cole I got to know well, and he'd been in the program for 6 years, and he was in grade 9 in this visual when I worked with him this 1 year, and he was reading at a grade 4 level. Now the tricky thing with Cole is attention. He has issues focusing, and he gets very bored in school. So Paul, the tutor, shaped the program around a way of sequencing the content so that he could keep Cole with him, keep him engaged with him. So they would start off on a common text. So Cole would bring in a narrative text, and this text was about medieval times. And Cole had created a medieval village in Minecraft, so he had to read a bit about the weapons that people would use during the medieval times, weather systems, what sort of structures they would build. And then they would replicate it, and he'd show Paul how he'd actually build it through bricks in Minecraft. Now, I know Minecraft is a bit of an older thing now. Fortnite has taken over. But with Minecraft, he would show him how to make the intricate little houses. And the level of detail was remarkable for Cole. And then they would eventually start a writing task. So you see there was the scaffolding, and there's nothing terribly new in this kind of pedagogy. It's interest-driven, right? That's been around for a long time. I suppose the difference is that it was, the metacognition is not new either, but I think that the ways in which Paul describes sequencing it thoughtfully and sitting beside him and assessing how he was doing felt unique to me, and the end product. And he emulated that with a lot of the children who would come into the tutoring service. So the Minecraft study, we had a lot of interview data. There was a classroom piece I wasn't involved in. I would come in for the stimulated recall interviews. So I sat into about 15 of these. And I think the most interesting one, and they were all fascinating. I mean, we had some of the kids in the study who would make interactive periodic tables within Minecraft. But this young man was very interesting. He created this architectural world in Minecraft where he would talk about creating Frank Lloyd Wright houses and Frank Gehry houses, and the ways the doors had to be smaller in Frank Lloyd Wright houses because Frank Lloyd Wright was shorter, and he didn't ever want to feel that he was intimidated by a space. He wanted to feel like he had a bigger stature. So he would learn all of these very interesting autodidact kind of facts. Again, somebody who was underachieving in school. And so he created this street with these different buildings. And to me, it was very impressive. And he would just say, as he was playing, I was this annoying woman asking questions. He'd say, well, these are just random things that I build sometimes. I don't know why you're sort of going on about this. But to me, it felt remarkable. To me, it felt like something that was, this young man really was learning about some things that I never would have been exposed to necessarily at the age of 13. Crayons and iPads, interesting study across 5 early years contexts. Again, lots of data from this one, parent surveys, interviews, lots and lots of observations, lots of multimodal artifacts. But the most interesting aspect of this study was that what we expected when we went in is there would be a dramatic shift when we went from the classic early years pretend kitchen, children playing on the sand table, playing with wooden blocks, and then iPads would come in. You'd think, what? They'd go right to the iPads, and they'd leave the pretend kitchen, and they'd leave the sand table. But that didn't happen. What happened was they would go to the sand table, then they would go to an app that emulated the sand table. Then they'd go to the pretend kitchen, and they'd make their cake, and they'd go to Grandma's kitchen and make a cake with Grandma, and Grandma sends you a kiss. So it was this movement, non-virtual, virtual, and it was fluid, and it didn't change the environment very much, you know, and they weren't glued to the iPad. It was a way of seeing that there's this naturalized flow. And there was nothing wrong with it. So Peter Freebody added this in, knew he'd be here. No, I'm kidding. Says literacy is a classic instance of a self-growing set of skills in societies such as ours. Rich literacy begets richer literacy. In the new circumstances we find ourselves accessing and working on the edges of our capabilities in our jobs and in our learning, and we develop then even further through middle age, let alone through the middle years of schooling. So it's just an eloquent way of talking about how these literacy practices beget other ones, and they're naturalized. And that's why I admire you so much, because I think that being a teacher is incredibly hard now, because you navigate these different things, and you don't have the methods. I mean, even being in Nordic countries that we hold up high, you're still kind of having to put a lot of work into the planning and assessing, especially when you deal with linguistic diversity, which you deal with in abundance. So what? So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about the arts, because I feel, and the arts were part of the previous keynote, they're undermined and they're so powerful. So one of the things about the last decade is I've worked with arts educators. I figured out early on in my time there that there were the visual artists and the people in music education and drama education had our teacher ed students in the palm of their hand. And then I go into classrooms and those arts-based teachers had students in the palm of their hands. And I knew that there was something there. And of course, the arts predates the whole digital, but it strongly informs the digital, right? It may not be a screen, but it's the same kind of a logic to or modes in play. So probably one of my favorite studies over the last decade was Community Arts Zone. In Community Arts Zone, again, I love Shirk, Canadian funder. It was ethnographic, as it always is, and multimodal. It had interviews, observations, and lots of artifacts, lots of students. There's a documentary film based on the project, and it's international. So one of the nice things about the Canadian government is it funds, I'll just go forward one slide, it funds national, international work. They have grant money for international people to be involved, to feed into Canadian research. So we had Chris Gutierrez, who's at the University of California, who did a study with Hispanic families where grandparents and children in an early years context created little films together. And then we had Freedom Market, which was Joanne Larson in Rochester. She had a very unique study. She created a community mural and had a series of arts workshops within a local community. It was like a greengrocer, really. It was like a local store called Freedom Market in a very poor African-American neighborhood in Rochester. And then finally, Kate Paul, Abby Hackett, and Steve Poole did a series of museum installations, watching children move around installations and interviewing parents about how they experience the art in the museums. So very different studies, but they all kind of played on this notion of accessing the arts. But in Niagara, we had a music project where a music educator looked at a teacher who sang her whole curriculum from beginning to the end of the day, and how language worked embedded within the music. We had a movement tableau activity with written artifacts that went along with it. We had a play building research study about body image in adolescence, and that was quite sad because you realize adolescents really have poor body images generally, but it was a way of writing plays about body image. Drama, where actors would come in and teach children about different acting techniques. And then finally, the one I was most involved with was photography, where students created conceptual photographs and artist statements in the style of Cindy Sherman. How many people know Cindy Sherman? Right, not very many. So Cindy Sherman is a very well-known American photographer who creates conceptual photographs. So she would do photographs depicting claustrophobia, for example, or loneliness, or archetypes like the 60s housewife or the 70s feminist. And so students were tasked with this, and we had highly creative photographs. We had one girl who looked at madness, and somebody else who looked at bulimia, some very heavy topics, but also some lighter topics. So some who looked at depicting Marilyn Monroe. And so there were a variety of them, and then they had these beautiful narratives they wrote alongside them. Now, we did the same thing with language learners. We did it with a group of newly arrived Syrians. Again, it was an activity they got very engrossed in because they could take photographs of their own lives, of the literacies that they live, and have a theme around it. And then finally, present day, I'm doing a study that's over 5 years, 5 different projects going into local high schools. And there is an adult literacy project as well with newly arrived Canadians, mostly Syrians. And that one is documentary filmmaking with teenagers, with a documentary filmmaker coming in, with an English teacher, and they're co-teaching how to make a documentary film. A coding project with professional coders, creating digital stories in grade 3, and then a grade 2 classroom doing graphic stories that became animated films. Right now we're doing a video game one with video game designers and grade 10 students, and then finally, again, the Cindy Sherman project. So I give you these research studies more as ways that I've tried to get at what is happening to us as teachers, and how can we start to build a sense of opening up and expanding what literacy is, and really in a serious way thinking about what our students are coming in with. And also meeting them halfway. So I'm also, it's not that I'm against traditional. I'm not saying that traditional literacy skills aren't important, but I think once you have them in there, you have the audience to be able to introduce that. So this is a little example of, and I don't know where Patrick is, but I told him not to be too far away. Of a little animated film that the grade 2s made. So they had to make flip books over the 6 weeks. And the flip books they would make into little films. So this was just a very quick one that Sophie made, but I really liked it. It was started off moving from a paper-based, you know, little Post-it notes. And then with each one, there were subtle little changes each one, and she made the movie. Now, she did that all on her own, right? We did a little bit of scaffolding. And then she went off and created a whole bunch of these little flip books. Now, she didn't put them to film necessarily, but it was that kind of thing where they became really into a medium and modalities, that they wanted to create these designs. So I probably get overly passionate or a bit utopian about this stuff, but I do think that there is something here. And the something here is about overall, if you ask me what my findings are, and I always find that's a really difficult one, maybe that's a bad sign. I think collapsing silos we have to accept. I know on Monday you had a session where different people came together into a room. And one of my big things, and people always, they actually shoot me down a lot for this, but I do think that we need to have cross-sector work. I do think that we need to have other professionals come in and help us work with what we have in terms of policy and pedagogy and assessment. And then you're experts in education, right? So you know what will work and what doesn't work. You know how people learn. I think it's being explicit about design and aesthetics. It's okay to talk about design, and I'm not against frameworks that say, you know, design and redesign and available design and teaching overtly, but how? Like, how do you do that? It's one thing to say it. So I think being explicit about this is how you teach photography. You can teach conceptual photography, you can teach literal photography, you can teach close shots, faraway shots, create conditions for creativity. I'm part of Jackie Marsh's large European grant on maker spaces and actually opening up your classroom to studio time and saying, here's a bunch of topics, or here's a problem, try to solve it. Crossing context for different flows of meaning. So that's kind of a vague way of saying creating a space in your classroom that allows for that, right? So allows for different kinds of learning to happen. Some teachers opt for no seats, some teachers opt for kind of creating little domestic spaces within classrooms, but try to diversify that way. Low to moderate technology. It's not I'm actually not really a hugely digital person, but I think you try to combine the two and make it and have those relational moments. So you need to have the solitary moments, but you also need to create the relational moments when they can talk through what they're doing. These are probably not earth-shattering at all. You probably already do these things. But certainly they are the lessons learned that I've had over the course of what I've done. And I like this quote, which isn't academic at all, but I think it's helpful, and it's Winston Churchill, and it's always wise to look ahead, but difficult to look further than you can see. And we have no clue what's coming down the pipeline. But I do know that we have to move at a quicker pace than we are, because we're not really meeting our students, at least maybe you are here, but I know where I am, we're not. A lot of students are quite bored, and I find that sad to see. And these are a whole bunch, and this is the worst slide. Like in terms of design, never do this, because you can't read it. I can barely read it. I can tell I'm aging because I can hardly see what these points are. But incorporate more visuals, right? Ask students to describe how they read screen-based texts. What happens when they read the orientation of text. Bring in photographs, make maker spaces. You probably do all this. Include lots of modes. Have students create moving image pieces. Combine larger text with shorter texts. Read multimodal texts like short movies and TED Talks, or read them as in watch them, analyze them, so on and so forth. So that's really the message. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.